Sergeant Donald Krey wanted the corner booth at the Millford Grill, and the quiet man in the worn canvas jacket, who had been sitting there since 7, told him no. Krey called it obstruction. He walked the man out to the parking lot in handcuffs in front of every person who had come in for a Tuesday morning breakfast, smiling the way a man smiles when he has handled something cleanly. Nobody in Millford Junction said a word. Not one person standing in that lot or pressed against the diner window opened their mouth. What Krey did not know was that the man in the handcuffs had served as Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for 7 years, had retired 18 months ago, and had driven himself to Millford Junction specifically because Krey's name had appeared on 3 formal complaint files that crossed his desk before he left office. Files he had never had time to act on and had not been able to stop thinking about since. Then 4 dark blue expeditions came down Main Street. The drive from Saskatchewan took 2 hours and 40 minutes on a clear morning, longer in mud season, which it nearly was. Ewan Ridley had left before 5 because he had not been sleeping well anyway, and because arriving before the town woke up suited the purpose of the visit better than any other time. He drove a neighbor's Silverado, 12 years old, with a crack in the passenger mirror and a pine tree air freshener that had been there long enough to smell like nothing at all. He wore the canvas jacket he wore when he checked on the quarter section he still owned outside Moose Jaw. He carried no rank insignia, no credential wallet, no service sidearm. He was 56 years old. His wife, Eleanor, had been gone for 4 years, long enough now that grief had stopped arriving as a wave and had settled into something more like a watermark, always present at the back of whatever room he was in, not painful the way it had once been, just there. It had made him quieter. He had been a quiet man before, and he was a quieter one now, which had served him in good ways and in bad ones, and he had mostly stopped trying to sort which was which. He had spent 33 years with the RCMP, organized crime files out of Winnipeg, a major fraud unit in Toronto, a posting overseas through Interpol that he was not permitted to discuss in any specific detail, even now. He had risen in a way that genuinely surprised him more than it surprised anyone watching. He had been appointed commissioner in a room in Ottawa with the Governor-General present, and he had served in that office for 7 years, long enough to understand in a detailed and irreversible way exactly how much the institution could do, and exactly how much it could not. The 3 complaints from Millford Junction had come through the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission, routed to his desk in the last 8 months before his retirement. They were not the most dramatic files on the docket. They described a town of 3,200 people in which a single sergeant had run the local detachment for 16 years, and in which certain things had become quietly accepted as the cost of ordinary life. A man whose small engine repair business had been cited 6 times in 1 calendar year for violations that had never troubled any previous inspector. A woman whose missing person report, her adult son, found unharmed 3 provinces away, had been filed 2 weeks after she submitted it, with a timestamp that made the delay look like 48 hours. A retired schoolteacher who had spent 11 hours in a holding cell over a noise complaint was never formally charged, and whose account of what had been said to her in that cell did not appear anywhere in any record the detachment produced. The analyst who had set all 3 files side by side had written 1 word in the margin: pattern. Ewan had read them on a Sunday in his kitchen in Saskatchewan with his second coffee going cold, and he had thought about them for a long time. He spoke to nobody official about the visit. His former deputy, now serving as acting commissioner, knew his general whereabouts because Ewan had given his word to check in, and 2 members of the Professional Responsibility Directorate were stationed in the town of Bracken, 41 kilometers up the highway, close enough to reach him and far enough that no one in Millford Junction would notice federal plates parked overnight. That was the arrangement. He had made similar ones in worse places. At 6:52, he pulled onto Main Street and drove its length once before parking in front of the only sit-down restaurant in town. The Millford Grill had a hand-painted sign above a door that needed weather stripping, and the lot was already 2/3 full. Through the window he could see a counter with round stools, a row of booths along the far wall, and a waitress moving between them with a coffee pot held low against her hip. Two RCMP cruisers and a half-ton sat across the street in front of a low building with the red and gold shield above the door. He went in. The woman behind the counter gave her name as Priscilla Hartman without being asked. The way people who have worked the same floor for years introduce themselves because they have learned it saves time. She told him to sit wherever. He took the corner booth at the back left wall, which let him see the entrance and the front window and the counter all at once, and which was a habit he had stopped noticing he had about 20 years ago. He ordered black coffee and the breakfast special and told Priscilla he was not in a hurry. She wrote nothing down. At 7, he made his first check-in call. It took 9 seconds. Location, status, nothing of note. He ended it, put the phone in the inside pocket of his jacket, and watched the room settle around him. 2 men in work coveralls discussing a late equipment delivery, a woman reading her phone at the counter with her coffee in the other hand, a radio in the kitchen playing a farm report that came in slightly imperfect. In every measurable way, an ordinary Tuesday morning in an ordinary prairie town. Ewan ate his eggs and drank his coffee, and believed there was a reasonable chance he would leave this town in 3 days, with nothing more substantial than a confirmation of what the files already showed. At 7:38, the bell over the door changed the room. It did not stop conversation. It lowered it, the way a thermostat drops without anyone touching it. A sudden collective awareness and a number of people finding reasons to look at the table in front of them. Ewan kept his eyes on his coffee and used the chrome napkin dispenser at the edge of the table, which gave a serviceable reflection of the door. Sergeant Donald Krey came in first, hat in hand. Behind him a constable in her mid-30s, name tag reading Oswald, who went straight to the counter and filled her own mug without asking Priscilla anything. And behind them both, younger, maybe 28, a constable whose tag read Sumner. Sumner stayed near the door with his hands loose at his sides. His body camera was the only one of the 3 switched on. Krey worked the room on the way in. A word at this table, a first name at that one. He asked a man near the window about his father's hip surgery and waited for the full answer. He was not performing warmth. The warmth was real. That was what made 16 years possible. Not fear alone, not even fear primarily, but the genuine goodwill of a man people liked, until the day they needed to not like him and found they could not afford to. Krey reached the middle of the floor and stopped. There was a stranger in the corner booth. Priscilla saw the moment he saw it, and Ewan watched her hand tighten on the coffee pot, watched her weight shift toward his table, and then not complete the movement. She turned to the kitchen pass-through instead and stood there. That told him more than the 3 complaint files had told him. Oswald set her mug down. Sumner's eyes came up. Krey crossed the floor without hurrying and stood at the edge of the booth with an expression that was almost pleasant. "Morning," he said. "Don't recognize you." Ewan said he was passing through. He agreed it was a cold one. Krey nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. He said the corner booth had been his table since before the last renovation, that anyone in the room could confirm it, and that he would appreciate it if the gentleman would move to the counter where there was plenty of room. The room was fully silent. Someone's fork touched a plate and the sound was much too large. Ewan looked up at him. He said he had come in at 7:15. He said the booth had not been reserved or marked, and the waitress had told him to sit wherever. He said he intended to finish his breakfast where he was sitting. He said it without heat, the way a man gives a gate agent his ticket number. Krey's expression did not change, but his weight shifted. He said he did not think the gentleman understood how things worked in a small town. Ewan said he understood how a restaurant worked. He said the table was public seating, that no sign indicated otherwise, and that he had arrived first. He said if the sergeant preferred the corner booth tomorrow, he was welcome to come in before 7. Behind the counter, Priscilla closed her eyes. Oswald laughed once, short and disbelieving, and stopped when nobody joined her. Krey went very still. In 16 years in that building in front of those people, he had never been told no out loud. It had never been necessary to test whether anyone would say it, and Ewan, watching him carefully, saw the calculation happen in real time. The cost of being refused in public, and the number Krey arrived at, and the look on his face when he decided the cost was unacceptable. "On your feet," Krey said. Ewan asked politely on what grounds. That was the sentence, not the refusal, the question. Krey turned to the room before he answered, which was the tale of a man who needed an audience more than a reason. He announced that this individual had been asked twice to comply and refused twice, that he could not account for a stranger sitting in a corner booth with a direct sightline to the detachment's front door since before the building opened, that he was not in the habit of ignoring things he could not explain. He said the word obstruction and then repeated it, and by the second time he had already made it true in his own mind. Ewan set his fork down flat and put both hands on the table where everyone could see them. He did not stand. He said clearly, at a volume the entire room could hear, that his wallet was in his right jacket pocket and that he was not carrying a weapon. He said it so that every person in that building would remember the sentence later, almost word for word. Krey told him to stand up and turn around. Ewan stood. He turned. He put his hands behind his back without being instructed to, which was not a choice so much as 33 years of trained reflex, and it was the one piece of information he had not meant to give away. The cuffs closed on his left wrist, then his right. Krey ratcheted them one notch past secure, the way a man does when he is making a point rather than securing someone. Nobody in the diner moved. 40 people, not one word. That was what Ewan would keep afterward. Not the handcuffs. The silence. He stood facing the window and catalogued the room behind him in the reflection of the glass. The two men in coveralls with their eyes on their plates. The woman at the counter with her phone now face down beside her coffee. Priscilla at the pass-through with both hands flat on the counter and her jaw set in a way that had nothing to do with indifference. Every one of them knew this was wrong. Every one of them had done the arithmetic and arrived at the same answer. A stranger's bad morning was cheaper than 16 years of consequences. Near the window, a man in a gray work jacket had his phone angled low at the edge of the table. It stayed there for about 15 seconds. Then the man looked at Oswald and put the phone in his breast pocket and wrapped both hands around his mug and kept them there. Constable Sumner took one step forward. He said the sergeant's name. Krey told him to get the door. Sumner stood there. Some internal clock ticked. Ewan watched him in the glass and saw the exact moment the man decided he was not ready to be brave today, and saw also that the green light on Sumner's body camera was still burning steady. Sumner got the door. Oswald walked Ewan by the arm out to the lot. Krey lifted the half-finished plate from the table, considered it, and set it on the counter near Priscilla without a word. He sat down in the corner booth. He was sitting there, signaling Priscilla for his usual, when they led Ewan past the window toward the cruiser. At no point had Ewan said who he was. He could have ended it before the cuffs came out. He knew that. He could have said his name and his former title, and watched the color leave Krey's face right there between the pass-through and the pie case, and it would have been over before his coffee went cold. Every instinct trained into him over 3 decades said stop this now, that a former commissioner of the RCMP in handcuffs in a prairie diner was a story that would write itself badly and quickly. But he had come here because of 3 letters. 3 ordinary people. No badge, no institution, no name that changed the arithmetic in a room. The retired schoolteacher. The woman whose son went missing. The man with the small engine business. Every one of them had stood exactly where he was standing now, with no title to say out loud and nobody coming up the highway. Reports written in Ottawa read very calmly. He had said that in a briefing room on a different file, and everyone had nodded as though they understood it completely. He understood it differently now. So he let Oswald walk him out. He let the bell over the door ring behind him. He stepped from the warmth and the smell of coffee into the flat, cold light of a Saskatchewan October morning, with his hands locked behind his back, and behind him Donald Krey settled into the corner booth and told Priscilla loud enough to carry through the glass that he would take his usual. The parking lot gathered an audience before the door finished closing. They came to the diner windows the way people come when something is happening to someone else, close enough to see, far enough back that no one outside could say for certain who was watching. Ewan was placed against the rear quarter panel of the second cruiser. Oswald stood beside him with her thumbs in her belt, satisfied, like a person who has just finished a task correctly. Krey came out last, adjusted his hat at the threshold, and surveyed the lot with visible satisfaction before beginning to speak to no one in particular, which meant he was speaking to everyone. He said he had been doing this job for 16 years, and the day he stopped asking questions about strangers, watching his building from a corner booth, was the day this town got itself hurt. He said a man who refuses a straightforward request is telling you something about himself. Nobody contradicted him. Ewan counted 22 people within clear earshot of what had happened. The man with the phone still in his jacket, standing by his half-ton. Priscilla Hartman, who had come as far as the diner doorway and stopped there with a dish towel in her hand, and who was the only person in Millford Junction looking directly at him. A woman from the insurance office across the street who had not moved since she heard the cruiser door. Not one of them said a word. He was not angry with them, which surprised him a little. He had expected to be. But a stranger costs you nothing. Donald Krey costs you everything for as long as you intend to keep living here, and 16 years is long enough to teach an entire town to run that calculation without noticing it is running. Sumner came out and stood by the front fender of the first cruiser. He had not touched Ewan once. His body camera light was still on. Oswald noticed. She told him he was running his battery down over a table dispute. Sumner said that RCMP policy required continuous recording during a custody transport. He said it flatly, the way a person recites a rule they have decided to stand behind because it is the only thing left they have to stand on. Krey turned around. He looked at Sumner for a moment, not unkindly, the way a man looks at a new hire who has spoken out of turn in front of a customer, and told him that when he had 16 years, he could decide what needed documenting. He said it warmly. 2 people in the lot laughed. The green light stayed on. Sumner did not switch it off, and he did not look at his sergeant again, and Ewan filed that away with everything else. At 8 o'clock, the phone in Ewan's inside pocket began to ring. It rang against his ribs, muffled 6 times, and stopped. Krey was telling a story about a stolen ATV on a back-country road 3 summers back, and the phone was simply part of the background of a morning that was going well for him. It rang a second time 40 seconds later, then a third. Nobody reached for it. Nobody searched his jacket. Nobody asked whose it was. Ewan stood against the cold metal of the cruiser and let it ring, and for the first time since the cuffs went on, something in his face changed. Not fear. Patience. The particular kind of patience that belongs to a man who knows something is already in motion and does not need to be the one who starts it. 41 kilometers up the highway in Bracken, 2 members of the Professional Responsibility Directorate listened to 3 consecutive missed calls go to voicemail, confirmed a location ping that had not moved from a diner parking lot in 14 minutes and were rolling within 90 seconds. A superintendent from the Regina Division put a second vehicle behind them 8 minutes after that. And by 8:20, the words commissioner and no contact had reached Ottawa, and the acting commissioner was standing at his desk with 2 phones in his hands. They came from the west end of Main Street at 8:41, 4 of them dark blue, moving fast, and the sound arrived before the sight did. The lead expedition pulled into the Millford Grill lot at an angle that closed the entrance. The second stopped on the street. The third and fourth blocked the driveway and the alley and stayed there with their engines running. Doors opened at once. 8 people climbed out in dark windbreakers with RCMP across the back in yellow, and every one of them had credentials already in hand. The lot went silent in the space of a breath. The man with the coffee mug set it down on the hood of his truck without appearing to know he'd done it. Oswald's hand went to her belt and stopped halfway. Krey turned from the story he'd been telling. A woman came around the front of the lead vehicle, mid-40s, dark suit under the windbreaker, moving with the economy of someone who has run real scenes. She did not look at the crowd or the vehicles or the diner. She scanned the lot in one pass, and her eyes found Ewan before the sweep was finished. Superintendent Ruth Pelletier, she said, Professional Responsibility Director at RCMP. I'm looking for Ewan Ridley. Krey did the thing that would follow him for the rest of his life. He smiled. He stepped forward, pleased to be useful, pleased to be the man in charge on his own ground with federal officers asking him a question. He pointed with his whole hand at the man in handcuffs standing against the rear panel of his cruiser. That's your guy right there, Krey said. Picked him up about 45 minutes ago in the diner. Obstruction. If he's part of your business, he's yours. But I'll tell you right now, he'd been sitting in there watching our detachment front door since before we opened. Nobody moved. Pelletier looked at Ewan. Something crossed her face and was gone. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped into a register that carried further than shouting would have. "Commissioner Thorne," she said, and stopped. She corrected herself, unhurried. "Commissioner Ridley, are you injured?" Ewan said he was not. Behind her, a chief superintendent from Regina came forward and did not address Krey at all. He addressed the lot. He held his credentials open and turned slowly so that the diner windows and the men at the trucks and every member present could see the photograph and the seal. "This is Ewan Ridley," he said, former commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Served 7 years as the senior officer of this institution. He is present in Millford Junction under federal authority. As of this moment, this is a directorate scene. The sound that went through the parking lot was not a gasp. It was smaller than that, and much worse. It was the sound of 24 people understanding the same thing in the same second, and none of them willing to be the first to say it out loud. Priscilla Hartman's hand came up over her mouth. Krey did not move. His arm was still half raised from the pointing. The color left his face in stages, from the top down, and then he laughed once, a short, flat sound with nothing behind it, and said that was not possible. Pelletier told him it was. Krey said the man had shown no identification. Ewan spoke then for the first time since the diner door had closed behind him, and he did not raise his voice. He said, "I told you exactly where my wallet was, in front of every person in that building. You didn't look." Krey's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. Oswald had gone the color of new concrete. She was looking at her own hands, the one that had been on the arm of the man she had walked to the cruiser, and looking at it the way a person looks at something they have just realized they cannot put down. Sumner took 2 slow steps back and put his palms out at his sides, face forward, and that was the single most professionally correct action taken by anyone in a Millford Junction uniform that morning. His camera light was still green. It had recorded everything from the moment Krey crossed the diner floor, and every person standing in that lot would spend a long time being grateful that a young constable had been too stubborn to switch it off. Pelletier extended her hand and told Krey to produce the key. He reached for it. His fingers did not work correctly, and he dropped it once and had to crouch to retrieve it from the asphalt, and there was not a sound anywhere in the lot while he did. Then Ewan said something nobody expected. "Not yet." Pelletier stopped with the key in her hand. Ewan said evenly that the cuffs stayed on until the scene was fully documented. He wanted photographs from every position. He wanted the location of every vehicle on record. He wanted the name of every person presently in that lot written down while they were still here. And he wanted all of it done with the restraints exactly as Krey had placed them. He said that a man had been removed from a restaurant in this town that morning for finishing his breakfast, and that the only difference between himself and the 3 people who had written to Ottawa was that his phone had already been ringing with someone on the way. He said the record was going to show what it actually looked like. The cuffs stayed on for 19 minutes. The former commissioner of the RCMP stood in a diner parking lot in handcuffs, while directorate officers photographed him from every angle, and every person in Millford Junction watched, and Donald Krey stood 6 feet away and was made to watch longest of anyone. Then it came apart very quickly. 2 officers crossed the street and served a production order on the duty constable inside the detachment before she had finished standing up. The camera on the bracket above the detachment door came down within the hour and went into an evidence bag. So did the camera above the Millford Grill's register, with Priscilla Hartman's written consent, which she gave so quickly that she signed the form standing up against the pie case before the officer had finished explaining what it was for. At 9:20, from a terminal inside his own detachment, Krey filed a supplemental narrative describing a subject who had become agitated and refused multiple requests to identify himself. 40 people had watched none of that happen. He filed it while federal officers stood visible through his window in the parking lot. System access was suspended at 9:55. 16 years of arrest reports, evidence inventories, use of force records, and dispatch logs went under directorate seal before noon, and the supplemental narrative went under with all of it. Timestamped, unamendable, 28 minutes old. Oswald surrendered her body camera. It contained 11 seconds of recording for the entire shift, which became a document all by itself. Sumner handed his over without being asked, unclipped it himself, and read out the serial number before passing it across. Pelletier looked at the steady green light on its front, looked at the constable for a moment, and wrote something in her notebook. The man in the gray work jacket, a carpenter named George Adair who drove 40 minutes each way to buy materials in Millford Junction, waited until the lot had thinned and then came to the chief superintendent with his phone extended in both hands. 31 seconds of video. Krey crossing the diner floor. The word obstruction. He said he had put the phone in his pocket when Oswald looked at him and had been sitting in his truck for almost an hour trying to decide whether to walk back over. The superintendent took the phone and told George he was the first person from that building to move. Then the thing nobody had planned began. People started coming across the street. Linda Favreau came first, a retired schoolteacher, 61, who had spent 11 hours in a holding cell over a noise complaint and had never been formally charged, and whose account of what had been said to her in that cell did not appear anywhere in any record. Her hands were shaking when she reached the superintendent, and she started her sentence 3 times before it came out. After Favreau, a man whose repair business had been cited 6 times in a single year. After him, a woman who had waited 2 weeks to see a missing person report filed with the correct date. By noon, there were 11 people in the lot. By 2 o'clock, Pelletier had moved inside the town hall because the line was visible from the hardware store on the corner. 16 years of quiet arithmetic, and the whole town was doing the math out loud at once. The records did not require interpretation, which is the particular misfortune of men like Krey. They believe the danger lies in what people say. It almost always lies in what they wrote down. 11 arrest reports carried timestamps amended after filing. 3 evidence logs listed property values in the seizure entry that did not match the disposition column. 9 complaints against the detachment had been declined by the Regional Review Office, 7 of them without a formal file having been opened. And in the matter of the retired schoolteacher, no Crown attorney had ever been notified that any arrest had occurred at all. Krey made calls from the sidewalk with his hat in his other hand, and the lot watching him make them. He called the staff sergeant in the regional division, who listened for 2 minutes and said he would need to escalate. He called a lawyer. He called a member of town council, who told him to speak to the mayor and ended the call. He stood on the sidewalk afterward, with the phone at his side, and did not dial a 4th number because there was not one. By mid-afternoon, 2 television vans had parked at the east end of Main Street. At 3:45, in front of the detachment he had run for 16 years, a senior officer from the provincial division formally suspended Krey pending investigation. Krey surrendered his service weapon and his commission card. He unpinned the badge himself and set it on the hood of the nearest cruiser. The sound it made on the metal was very small. Then Pelletier advised him of his rights on the public sidewalk, in front of the people from the parking lot who were still there to hear it. That evening, Pelletier came to the room Ewan was working out of at the town hall and set a paper cup of coffee on the folding table. She sat down across from him and asked the question that had been sitting in her since 8:41 that morning. She said he could have ended it before the first expedition cleared the highway. She had watched Sumner's footage twice and counted at least 2 moments where a single sentence from him would have stopped everything before the cuffs came out. Ewan turned the paper cup a half-turn and did not drink from it. He said that before he retired, 3 letters from this county had reached his desk in a 4-month span. 3 ordinary people. Same experience, nearly identical language in all of them. He said he had read those letters in Ottawa in a room where everyone agreed the situation was serious, and where nobody present had ever been on the other end of it. I needed to know what it actually feels like, he said, to be the man against the car with nothing to say out loud, not to read about it, not to have someone brief it to me, to be that person. Pelletier said that by 8:40 he had had 4 vehicles coming. Linda Favreau didn't, Ewan said. That is the entire point. She sat 11 hours in that holding cell, and nobody in this town came for her. The only difference between her and me this morning is that my phone was already ringing. He said that if he had identified himself in the diner, the detachment would have produced an apology and a corrected report by nightfall, and 16 years would have stayed exactly where they were. He said the morning in the parking lot was the only evidence that could not be explained or argued away, and that he had let it happen because he was the first person in Millford Junction in 16 years who could afford to. Pelletier turned that over for a while. The formal charges came down the following week: breach of trust, falsification of records, misconduct in office across multiple counts. Oswald was named in 2. She resigned by letter the day before she was served, which changed neither the counts nor her exposure to them. The regional review office that had declined 9 complaints without opening files was placed under its own separate review. Krey's confrontation with Ewan happened 2 days later on the front steps of the detachment, mid-afternoon, with Krey's lawyer present and 2 of Ewan's officers visible nearby. Krey looked smaller without the uniform. He said he had kept this town safe for 16 years. He said there had been no homicide in Millford Junction since 2012. He said he had pulled a family out of a ditch on a county road in January with his own hands. He said half the people who had lined up at the town hall had his personal number in their phones. He said all of it flatly, like a man reading his own record back to someone who had not asked for it. Ewan told him every word of that was true, that it was in the file, and that it would go to the Crown with everything else. Then Krey said the thing he had clearly been building for 2 days. He said none of it would have happened if a stranger had not sat down in his booth. He said if the man had just moved to the counter, none of it. He did not finish the sentence because he heard himself finishing it. No, Ewan said. He said that people always believe the collapse started the day someone caught them, and that it never does. He said 11 reports had been amended before he crossed the town limits. He said Linda Favreau had been held without Crown notification 7 years before he pulled onto Main Street. He said none of that had anything to do with a corner booth. He said, "You didn't fall this morning because you put cuffs on the former commissioner. You'd have fallen the same way if I'd been nobody. You'd just have fallen slower, and it would have cost more people on the way down." The moment a person can't tell the difference between the law and their own standing in a room, the badge stops being the job. It becomes a delay. Krey looked at the railing under his hand. He said very quietly that he had never thought of himself as a corrupt man. Ewan said he believed that. He said it was the reason the file was 16 years long. He drove back to Saskatoon 2 days after that, because a former commissioner cannot run a professional responsibility investigation and should not try. Pelletier stayed. The review was consolidated within 10 days, and Crown charges followed the week after. The town did not celebrate. That was the thing nobody reading the summary in Ottawa would understand. There was no applause on Main Street when the badge came off the hood of the cruiser and went into an evidence bag. There was no crowd. By 4 o'clock, the lot outside the Millford Grill had emptied. The half-tons were gone. Millford Junction had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Because Krey was not the only person exposed that morning. 40 people had watched a man be walked out of a restaurant in handcuffs for finishing his breakfast, and 40 people had decided in the same second that it was not worth the cost. They had gone back to their coffee. They had watched from the window with their mugs in their hands, and now they were sitting in their own kitchens with a different answer in front of them, which was that the thing they had been calling common sense for 16 years had another name. Priscilla Hartman closed the diner at 1:30, 4 hours early, turned the sign around, and sat in the corner booth with the lights off for a long time. She told Ewan about it later in a statement, and that was how he learned it. Linda Favreau went home after giving her statement and did not answer her door for the rest of the day. 3 people came and knocked, wanting to know what she had said to the federal officers in the parking lot. She told them the following morning. All 3 drove to the town hall and got in the line. The county appointed an acting officer in charge for the detachment. They gave it to Wade Sumner, who was 28 years old, and who said out loud at the council meeting, on the record, that he had taken 1 step forward in that parking lot and then gone and gotten the door instead, and that a man who had done that should not be handed a building. A retired superintendent who had asked to sit in on the appointment said the only thing he said all evening. He said that across 16 years, Sumner was the only person in that detachment who had ever left a light on. Sumner took the job. The reforms were neither fast nor dramatic. Body cameras went to continuous recording on every contact, uploading to a provincial server accessible to no one inside the local detachment. Arrest reports locked at filing, with any amendment logged separately and visible as an amendment. Every custodial hold required Crown notification within 6 hours or the person walked. An outside review board was established with 4 community members, and Linda Favreau was one of the 4, which nobody in the room found amusing, and everybody found appropriate. None of it was new. All of it had existed on paper somewhere in the provincial framework already. It had simply never been enforced by anyone who could be told no. What actually changed in Millford Junction was smaller and harder to write into a policy. People started talking. The line at the town hall ran for 11 days. By the end, there were 53 statements on record, and 38 of them concerned incidents more than 3 years old, which meant that for 3 years, the people in that town had been carrying the same story, and each one had believed they were the only one holding it. Ewan came back to Millford Junction on a Thursday 14 days after the morning he had arrived. He came at the same hour in the same borrowed Silverado, wearing the same canvas jacket. Pelletier had suggested something else. He had said no, and she understood why before he finished saying it. The lot was 2/3 full. He went in. The bell over the door rang. The room did not quiet the way a room quiets for a stranger. Every head in the building came up at once, and for a moment nothing happened at all. Then George Adair, sitting at the counter in the same gray work jacket, set both palms flat on the formica and stood up. The woman at the far table stood. The 2 men from the corner booth stood. Then the rest, in ones and twos, until no one in the Millford Grill was sitting down. Nobody said his rank. Nobody said commissioner. They stood the way people stand when they have run out of words, and standing is the only thing left that means something. Ewan understood what it was. It was not for the office he had held. It was not for the 4 expeditions that had come down Main Street. It was for 19 minutes in a parking lot with his hands behind his back. He nodded once to the room and went and sat in the corner booth. Priscilla Hartman brought coffee before he asked, the same as the first time, and her hand was not completely steady when she set it down. She did not take out her order pad. She said, "Black, breakfast special," and asked whether that was still right. Ewan said it was. She stayed at the edge of the table with the pot in her hand and told him she had been standing 4 feet from this booth, holding this same pot, and had not put it down, and had thought about it every morning since. He told her that her name was in the case record, that her signature on the consent form had been witnessed by 2 directorate officers, and that she had done more that morning than anyone else in the building. Priscilla went back to the kitchen and did not come out for a while. He ate the whole breakfast this time. Through the window he could see the detachment across the street, the shield above the door, the camera on a new bracket angled correctly at the lot. A light was on inside. At 10 to 8, Wade Sumner came out the front door, saw the Silverado in the lot, and looked across at the window. Ewan raised 2 fingers off the tabletop. Sumner nodded and walked to his vehicle. Ewan paid at the register and left the tip in cash under the edge of the plate, and made no speech, and nobody asked him for one. The bell rang a last time behind him. Pelletier was waiting by the lead vehicle with the door open. She asked where he wanted to go next. He gave her the name of a county in another province, 4 complaints in the file, a detachment nobody had audited in 11 years. She said the acting commissioner was going to lose his mind. Ewan said the acting commissioner could have the corner booth. The Silverado went out the west end of Main Street a little after 8 on a Thursday morning, and Millford Junction went back to work, and the diner filled up again, and the corner booth sat empty until somebody who had been waiting since 7 decided to sit in it. Power does not reveal a person. What reveals them is how they treat the people who appear to have none. The stranger with no title to say out loud, the man against the car with nobody coming for him. Donald Krey did not fall the morning he put handcuffs on the former commissioner of the RCMP. He had been falling for 16 years quietly, in the ordinary way that things erode when a building full of people decide that speaking costs more than staying silent, and it took almost nothing to turn it back. One constable who would not switch off a camera, one man who finally handed over his phone, one waitress who signed a form standing up before she had finished being asked, one man who stayed in his seat and finished his breakfast.